The Shaping of Gondor. Part 2. The Line of Meneldil. Chapter 1. Spring of Gondor. The year following his victory, Meneldil summoned the lords of the defeated fiefs to Pelargir to receive their renewed oaths of loyalty in a ceremony that greatly resembled the obeisance of Pelargir some 170 years earlier. Indeed, it is sometimes referred to in the histories as the second obeisance of Pelargir. The king then proceeded to heap all manner of honors and awards on those who had fought for him during the rebellion. The greatest gifts of all were bestowed on Tarkil, of course. Menildil had a great white stone column erected in Osgiliath, on which Tarkil's name was scribed, an honor to be henceforth reserved only for Gondor's greatest heroes. It still stands there, in weathered and broken form even to this day, one of the few faded remnants of this early age of Gondor's history. The king then granted the general a large and luxurious estate in his native Amphalas, where the latter eventually died in 108 in dignified splendor. In 75, King Meneldil took an unprecedented step by inviting all the great lords to Osgiliath to participate in the economic and financial reordering of the realm. Having learned the hard lesson of the Long Rebellion well, he realized that the way to best keep the loyalty and goodwill of his nobles was negotiation and compromise, and in any case, there were too many problems confronting him to deal with them all on his own anyway, even if he so willed it. For a fortnight, then, the majority of the kingdom's lords sat in council as the king's guests. Building plans were drawn up, authority claims were haggled over, debts forgiven, old scores settled. These conferences had the effect of helping to weld the land back together, for once they gave the appearance of Gondor's nobles having a voice in their king's decisions, instead of being at the whim of a willful tyrant. Other kings in the future would imitate Meneldil's example, and the Council of Gondor would again be summoned when matters of great kingdom-wide concern arose. The remainder of Meneldil's long reign was quiet. In fact, for 4.5 centuries after the end of the Long Rebellion, there was to be virtually nothing in the way of revolts or outer threats to the Seven Heartlands. These years were to eventually become known by the later scribes as the Spring of Gondor, the longest and most profound stretch of tranquility that Gondor and her people were ever to know. Improvements to roads and public structures were made where they could be afforded, and most of the debts that had been the cause of the Long Rebellion were called off. Many of the lords who owed them in the first place were dead, for one thing. In 86, a plot was discovered to assassinate the king which appeared to have the imprisoned lord Herr Calmo at its core, and preferring not to tempt fate, Meneldil had him executed. This incident did little to disturb the general peace, however. In 106, Meneldil's beloved queen, Narbethriel, died, and he mourned her bitterly, refusing to contemplate remarriage. This too set an unfortunate precedent whereby the kings eschewed the replacement of spouses, and this was also the first faint early sign of the eventual thinning of the bloodline of the Anarioni and the end of the line of kings. Construction projects occupied a good deal of the king's time during the latter part of his rule. In 112, the first of several great bridges over the Anduin was completed in Osgiliath. Sadly, it now lies in ruins, one of the many casualties of the destructions of war. The year 132 saw Minas Anor receive a much-needed refurbishment, with many ways being rebuilt and enlarged, and a new and larger outer wall erected. Likewise, of Meneldil's work there hardly now remains anything recognizable, as the fortress has now become a great city, renowned throughout the land. Meneldil died in 158, after having ruled for 156 years over Gondor. Only once has the length of this reign been exceeded in her history. Few kings had or would ever overcome such perils. Meneldil had inherited a kingdom worn out by a great war, and then seen it worn down further by a long rebellion that had very nearly broken it apart on the rack of king versus lord. Yet, through his wit and fortitude, he had come through and ultimately reconfirmed the strength of the crown. Through his wisdom and forbearance, he had healed a good part of the physical ravages of war, and gone far in repairing the sentimental bonds of good feeling between king and subject. Accordingly, genuinely loved in life, he was deeply mourned at his passing. In one other way is Meneldil exceptional. He was the last king among the Edain to be born in Numenor, and the last living link to that land of fable and glory. For 3.5 centuries following the death of Meneldil, Gondor knew little but peace abroad and bounty at home. The Spring of Gondor had arrived in full force. The attrition of the War of the Last Alliance and the Long Rebellion had left the kingdom utterly exhausted from strife, and in any case, most of the more warlike souls in the land were now dead. 4 Anarioni occupied the throne during these years: Kemender, Eärendil, Anardil, and Osterher. All were long-lived, and all are shrouded in mystery and legend. Only in the case of Osterher do we have any extensive or estimable records, and these are mostly in connection with the disasters associated with his reign. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Succeeding Meneldil was his eldest son, Kemender. He was a bluff, fun-loving prince who was renowned for his size and strength. Some legends claim that he could lift an ox cart clear over his head, although these are probably exaggerations. What is almost certainly not exaggerated is his desire to continue the peaceable acts of his father, and there is possibly no more humane or kindly king to be found in Gondor's history. To emphasize this, certain duties were lowered in many ports, which led to a flowering of prosperity and plenty unknown till then in the Bay of Belfalas. To better address the needs of his realm, Kemender would spend a good deal of his time on the road, on extended royal tours throughout the Seven Heartlands, inspecting the common ways, making repairs, and settling disputes. Among the most famous stories told of him concerned one such matter. In about the year 210, whilst passing through the town of Lonegund and Lebanon, Kemender noticed a slave market where some 40 indebted peasants were being auctioned off. Moved by their misery and suffering, the king challenged the slave merchant to a contest of strength. If he could hurl a stone further than Kemender, then the latter would receive considerable riches. If they could not, however, the slaves would be freed immediately. The merchant agreed, and thrust a heavy stone some 20 feet. The king then flung an equally large rock into the air with such force that it sailed more than twice that distance. The slaves were freed, and feasted with Kemender that night, and the trial of Lonegund thus passed into lore and song. When he wasn't busy lightening the pockets of slavers, the king was tending to the defenses of the land. In about 180, he had ordered the beginning of the construction of a great rampart across the northern border of the royal ward, a most impressive edifice that would in time come to be known as Anarion's Wall, in honor of its founder's grandfather. It was supposedly while inspecting this wall, in 238, that Kemender's rule came to an unfortunate end, when a mason, working on a scaffold, accidentally dropped a number of stones, one of which struck the monarch squarely on the head and killed him instantly. He was borne back to Osgiliath and entombed next to his father, mourned by many thousands who had benefited much from the edicts of this gentle king. Kemender had reigned for 80 years. Kemender's son, Eärendil, now took the white throne, and he was of quite a different sort from his father. Though he too possessed a love of food, drink, and merriment, there was a keener intellect, a greater appreciation of knowledge, of the arts and fine crafts. He was from the beginning of his reign determined to make Gondor not only prosperous, but cultured, and enriched in learning and beauty. For these endearments he is often referred to in the history tomes as Eärendil the Wise. To achieve this end, he sent emissaries to the lords of the greatest and smallest kingdoms alike in Middle-earth, requesting that their finest sages and artisans be sent south. Many, including Círdan of Lindon, Elrond half-elven of Imladris, and Durin the Fifth of Khazad-dûm obliged, and soon scribes, painters, potters, sculptors, and mummers from all the reaches of the north dwelt in Osgiliath as the king's guests. The most admired of these was the elven poetess Firizel Abdilarion, whose songs and verses were said to surpass in beauty and exquisiteness any that had ever been seen or heard in the courts of men. Around this time, the harp is supposed to have first been introduced at the court by the elves of Lindon, and it became a fixture there forever and after, during the times of feasting and celebration. Eärendil, who was himself a scholar of considerable ability, amassed a library of some 10,000 tomes and scrolls. He even tried his hand at writing, and the Black Book of Numenor is his, detailing the decline and downfall of that great and mythic kingdom. He authored also many graceful verses and songs. Of the artistic and literary doings of Eärendil's reign we know a good deal, but of the more practical side of things the records tell us very little. It would appear that he simply continued all the policies of his father, with the exception that in 275 he rescinded the indemnity on Æthelond in recognition of the contribution of the elves' artistry to the Gondorian realm. It is not even known exactly how he died. In any case, the life of this antiquarian monarch came to a quiet end in 324, probably in the company of one of the books he loved so much. There is a short verse by Firizel, which she dedicated to her patron Eärendil, and it serves as charming and fitting an epitaph as any. From the west the sea-bird wings her airy course. Whence she comes, none here may follow, as the dewdrops on the golden leaves of spring dare not touch the sun. Donning the winged helm now was Anardil, son of Eärendil, and once again the son's nature differed sharply from that of the father, for Anardil was no antiquarian, nor was he a conciliator like Menildil, nor a builder like Keminder. Instead, he seemed uninterested in much of anything, and went about his duties with perfunctory indifference. It was almost as if the role of being king bored him, and there is possibly no more inscrutable or enigmatic monarch to be found in Gondor's history. For only two things is his 87-year reign noteworthy: the completion of the Great Southern Road in 340, and his marriage. It is the second event that is more intriguing. Unlike nearly any other king before or after him in Gondor, Anardil was unmarried at the time of his accession, and in 328, after having sat the throne for 4 years, he searched the land for a suitable bride. The royal eye eventually settled on a certain Isilmo, the daughter of a minor Belfalassi lordling, and the two were soon wed. It was a happy union, resulting in 4 children, and was probably the only thing in the life of this lackluster king to give him real joy. It was a joy that was to be short-lived, however. In 371 Queen Isilmo died of illness, and with her death whatever feeble spark of light which had existed in Anardil's heart went out forever. After having a gorgeous tomb of white marble and jasper erected for his dead queen, Anardil informed his court and the Einitar that he would never utter another word until he was reunited with his wife in death. This vow of silence was evidently kept, and from this time on the king withdrew to his private chambers, seldom communicating or being seen by anyone. In time he would become known as Anardil the Silent, a befitting title, since silence does indeed characterize him both as a king and as a man. In the wider realm, meanwhile, the Spring of Gondor continued unabated, in fact, reaching its apex. Left to run itself, never had the kingdom's affairs been so quiet, her farms so plentiful, or her lords and merchants so untroubled by the royal tax collector. And when Anardil finally died in 411, mourned by few, if his subjects regretted his reticence, they had suffered little for it either. Alas, there was soon to be no shortage of suffering, for under his son and successor Osterher, the Spring of Gondor finally withered and died. There was nothing in the character of the new king himself that was to blame for this. Osterher was more prudent than Menildil, more learned than Keminder, more diligent than Eärendil, and warmer than Anardil. Yet Through sheer ill fortune and unpreparedness, his reign was to witness the undoing of the peace and security that his predecessors had taken for granted, and the end of the prosperity his people had known for so long. The new reign began auspiciously enough. Osterher bore little resemblance to his bland father either in appearance or mind, and he quickly went about reassuming many long overdue tasks and projects. In 420, for instance, construction was resumed on the fortress city of Minas Anor, and where a fourth level was begun, under the supervision of Malin Morthrind, a dwarven master builder who had been driven from his home in Khazad-dûm due to a scandal. Thus the majestic city, which was to one day serve as the seat of the realm, began to take recognizable shape, and the king made the citadel of the rising sun his primary summer residence. In 440, Osterher initiated a refurbishment of all the great roads and ways throughout the Seven Hardlands, as well as Anarion's wall to the north. Often, in contrast to the bookish Erindil or the reclusive Anardil, the king traveled throughout the provinces to oversee the work himself, as well as to converse with both lord and subject. In this way, many of the works and defenses of the kingdom, neglected for so many long years, were finally brought to completion. The king made another portentous contribution to history, when in 448 he effectively created the new office of steward. It seems that overwhelmed by the demands on his time, of the managerial duties of his many projects, Osterher felt the need for an assistant, and a court official by the name of Minionis was selected. Though he was never called steward, he was one in fact, in all but name. Minionis's duties mostly ran to merely keeping up with court agenda, records, receipts, and other addenda, but in time the importance of the office would grow immeasurably, until many centuries later it finally became supreme throughout the land in place of the crown. By 450, then, Osterher had much to congratulate himself on. The borders were once again manned properly, the treasury was full, and the common edifices were being remade. For the first time since Meneldil, Gondor was being governed according to a coherent and ambitious vision. Sadly, however, after about this time, everything began to fall apart. Sometime during Anardil's reign, a new group of tribesmen native to the vast plains of Rhûn began to make their presence felt in the hinterlands of Rhovanion, and by the early seasons of Osterher's rule were drawing near to the northern boundaries of Gondor. Because of their origins in the far easterly reaches of the continent, they quickly became known as the Easterlings, or Osterlings. Unlike most other bands of eastern barbarians, the Easterlings were notorious for their tendency towards savage destruction, enslavement, and the formation of confederations of unusually large numbers of tribesmen under their fighting banners. During the decades immediately following Anardil's death, they slowly but surely fanned out and reduced most of southern Rhovanion into submission. In about 450, a new and especially forceful and ambitious chieftain named Ruda came to power among them, after which trouble was nigh on the horizon for Gondor, for the royal ward and its fertile and vulnerable lands beckoned close to the south. In 455, Ruda began to lead assaults against Anarion's wall. At first, these were fairly easily turned away, for the Easterling raiding parties were paltry in number and rare in occurrence. These proved just a prelude, unhappily. By 460, the raids were becoming almost monthly, and the numbers of the raiders were steadily increasing. Osterher attempted to parley through envoys, of course, but these were routinely beheaded, flayed, or impaled by the Easterling captains. Ruda was a different sort of enemy. Things only grew worse from there. Anarion's wall proved insufficiently strong or well manned enough to contain all of the barbarians' incursions, so that the towns and villages near to the border began to be endangered. Bands of Easterlings would breach the wall, visit a night or two of pillaging and maiming, then retreat before the crown's mustered forces, only to return again once the soldierly presence was withdrawn. For 3 decades this game of cat and mouse went on, with Easterling assaults and tedious and costly Gondorian marches and countermarches becoming a common event to the eyes of those who lived nigh to the northern borders. Numerous calls for increased garrisons and enlargement of the White Guard were largely skimped on, if they were granted at all by the crown. These policies were rewarded, in turn, with only more determined efforts by the enemy to pluck advantage from Gondor's apparent incapacity. In 488, the situation was escalated considerably when a particularly vicious raid resulted in the sacking in North Ithilien of the town of Numina. Over 3,000 were killed and crucified, countless more carted off into slavery and torture, and a good deal of booty and treasure was stolen and scavenged from the town's warehouses, temples, and homes. At this, many of the nobility, even the king's son and heir, clamored for a mustering of Gondor's arms to decisively deal with the Easterling threat and avenge such an insult to her honor and sanctity. Osterher still equivocated, however. It is difficult to know for sure what was going on in the royal head, but it appears that the king was unwilling to provoke a long, grueling, and probably quite bloody war that he knew a full muster would entail. He was elderly by now, and uncertain as to whether full-scale war was necessary or even practical, preferring half measures as a means of prolonging the general peace. As it happened, the choice was made for him, when in 490 Ruda decided to dispense with raids and led a force of some 7,000 Easterling warriors across an especially weak point in Anarion's wall and into North Ithilien. With this, the Spring of Gondor finally came to a shattering end, for Ruda and his men took no quarter. In a matter of weeks, they had cut a swath of destruction, razing towns, torching farms, and taking untold numbers of victims and hostages alike. Their invasion took them all along the northern spurs of the Ephel Duath, and Osgiliath itself was only prevented from being endangered by the Easterlings' preoccupation with burning, raping, and looting as they advanced. To be sure, the White Guard did their best to hinder Ruda's progress through the countryside, but lacking sufficient reinforcements, there was little they could do but act defensively and evacuate as many people as possible to the relative safety of the environs of Osgiliath and Minisithil. It was in the midst of this carnage that Osterher died in 492. He had ascended the throne 81 years earlier with the ambition to restore Gondor to her former vigor, only to ultimately die with the border in tatters, the royal ward in flames, and his very capital threatened by savage foreign brigands. There is a tendency among scribes and balladeers to shame Osterher, to blame him solely for Gondor's humiliation at the hands of the Easterlings, and there is indeed a kernel of truth to this. The king's indecision, his failure to properly reinforce Anarion's wall, to respond to the sacking of Numina, to muster the full Gondorian army, to act in any masterly way, can all be laid fairly at his feet. Indeed, he is most often known in the histories as Osterher the Unprepared. It should be remembered, however, that for 4.5 centuries prior to Ruda's invasion, no enemy had threatened or trodden on Gondorian soil. She had known naught but peace from within, and had grown militarily weak and lazy from without for want of strong foes, lulled by a peace that both her kings and her people had thought unshakable and everlasting. By sharing in that complacency, the king was no more or less at fault than any of his captains, lords, or subjects. Unprepared Osterher may well have been, but none of the Anarioni who preceded him, Meneldil, Kemendir, Erendil, Anardil, would likely have fared any better against the Easterling threat, and some, Anardil the Silent comes to mind, would likely have done even worse. In truth, Osterher was a good and thoughtful monarch, who did much in the early part of his reign to lift Gondor out of the doldrums she had fallen into during the careless rule of his predecessors. Had he reigned at almost any other time, he would have gone down in history as a perfectly respectable king. He simply was not fashioned by either temperament or experience to be a warrior, and a warrior was unfortunately what the times required. It would be left to his son and successor to confront the Easterling menace, and prove himself the first truly great king of the line of Meneldil.